From the moment Pope Leo XIV appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, a subtle, reverent stillness seemed to spread across the square and ripple through the hearts of the faithful watching from around the world. For many, this was simply the ceremonial introduction of a new pontiff. But for others, those familiar with the ancient echoes of Catholic prophecy, this moment stirred something deeper. It awakened the memory of a prediction that has circulated through centuries of belief, mystery, and wonder. A prophecy attributed to one of the Church's most intriguing and debated visionaries, Saint Malachy. Now, before one dismisses such a prophecy as nothing more than another mystical legend from the medieval past, it's worth asking a simple but compelling question. What if there's more truth in this than we once thought? What if a vision written hundreds of years ago is beginning to unfold in real time today, in the heart of the Church, beneath the dome of St. Peter's, and in the life of the newly elected Pope Leo XIV? To understand why this prophecy has regained so much attention, we must first know what it actually says, and why it's sending shivers down the spines of scholars, theologians, and even ordinary believers. You see, Pope Leo XIV hasn't simply stepped into the shoes of his predecessor. Some believe he may have stepped into a role described centuries ago in the final line of a prophetic list, one that ends not just with a name, but with a warning. The origin of this prophecy traces back to a 12th century Irish archbishop named Saint Malachy. Known for his deep holiness and a life steeped in devotion and prayer, he is said to have received a vision during a pilgrimage to Rome. According to tradition, what was revealed to him wasn't just a message for his time, but for every era that would follow. He saw, it is said, the names, or rather, the symbolic mottos of 112 popes. The vision came as a list, written in Latin, each phrase supposedly pointing to the unique character or identity of a future pope, beginning with Pope Celestine II. For centuries, this manuscript remained hidden, sealed away in the depths of the Vatican's archives until the 16th century, when it was brought to light by a monk named Arnold Wion. At the time, a papal conclave was underway, and the manuscript's sudden emergence added a curious twist to the atmosphere. Wion claimed that these mysterious lines came from the very hand of Saint Malachy himself. Since then, they have fascinated the faithful and puzzled historians, becoming one of the most enduring and controversial prophecies in church history. What makes it especially compelling today is that many believe the list has been startlingly accurate, at least in hindsight. Critics argue that the descriptions are vague or interpretive. But believers point to how many of the Latin mottos seem to match aspects of the popes. They supposedly describe details of their heritage, symbols, family crests, or even their spiritual legacy. And now, here we are. According to the list, we have arrived at the final entry. Number 112. This last pope is not named in the same way as the others. Instead of a short Latin phrase, the final entry delivers something different, something weighty, something that doesn't describe, but forewarns. It speaks of a shepherd who will guide his flock through great trials. It references the city of 7 hills, a poetic reference to Rome, and ends with an allusion to judgment. In past decades, many began to speculate whether Pope Francis fulfilled this final role. But with his passing and the rise of Pope Leo XIV, a new wave of attention has surged. Could this newly chosen successor be the one Saint Malachy truly foresaw? Could he be the one meant to lead the Church through a time of purification, not destruction? Though Leo XIV has never publicly commented on the prophecy, his election has reignited conversations across seminaries, Catholic forums, and theological circles. His roots in Chicago and his mission years in Peru have painted him as a humble servant, close to the poor and attuned to spiritual need rather than institutional power. And it is precisely this pastoral character that some believe reflects the figure described in Malachy's vision, a shepherd in a time of trial. Still, it's important to say this. The Catholic Church does not officially endorse the prophecy of Saint Malachy as doctrine. It remains a private revelation, subject to interpretation, and not binding in faith. And yet, the intrigue remains. Because the list ends with a sense of finality. Not doom but decision. Not collapse but conversion. And in that mystery, many find themselves watching Pope Leo XIV with new eyes, asking not whether he is the last pope, but whether he is the right one for a time such as this. So now the question many are quietly asking becomes more pressing. Are we truly approaching the fulfillment of St. Malachy's prophecy? With the election of Pope Leo XIV, it seems as though a significant chapter is opening, one that could mark a profound transition in the spiritual narrative of the Church. But why now? What makes this moment feel so pivotal, and what makes this new pontificate feel so aligned with Malachy's final vision? To understand that, we must take a closer look at the uniqueness of this era. Pope Leo XIV, elected on the 13th of March in the year 2025, has arrived at a moment where the world and the Church within it faces profound questions. He is the first pope to come from the order of St. Augustine, bringing with him a deeply rooted pastoral experience from his years serving in Latin America, especially among communities in Peru. His voice, calm yet convicted, has already become known for its simplicity and depth, drawing attention not by controversy, but by clarity. His election follows a long line of leaders who each carried the Church through their time's distinct trials. What makes this new pontificate stand out is not merely where he comes from, or which religious order shaped him, but the spirit with which he serves. Pope Leo XIV has emphasized the importance of humility, of listening, and of healing not through dramatic pronouncements, but through gestures of presence, mercy, and consistency. And yet, like his predecessors, he inherits a church navigating a rapidly changing world. Doctrinal conversations continue to stir passionate debate within theological circles. Topics such as pastoral care for families, the role of tradition in a modern age, and how the Church accompanies those in complex situations are all under careful, prayerful discussion. These discussions are not marks of division, but rather signs of a living Church, a body that, while rooted in sacred truth, continues to walk with people in every era. One of the most talked about documents in recent Church history, Amoris Laetitia, addressed such questions with an invitation toward compassion and deeper discernment. While some embraced it as a necessary pastoral approach, others viewed its tone as requiring further clarification. Such theological tensions are not new, they have existed throughout the Church's long history, from councils to encyclicals, always seeking a greater understanding of how eternal truth meets the needs of the present. In August of 2017, a number of clergy and scholars voiced their concerns in an open letter, expressing their interpretations of certain teachings. Far from an act of rebellion, these moments reflect the spiritual seriousness with which leaders and laity approach the sacred teachings of faith. It's important to understand that within Catholicism, respectful theological dialogue is not only allowed, it is part of the Church's ongoing effort to seek clarity and holiness. With Pope Leo XIV now at the helm, many feel a renewed sense of hope. His calm demeanor, his attention to the marginalized, and his spiritual maturity are seen as timely gifts. His pontificate may not be marked by sweeping reforms or sudden shifts, but by something deeper rootedness, reverence, and renewal. He represents not a rupture from the past, but a continuity that breathes with the rhythm of tradition while looking ahead with grace. So if St. Malachy's prophecy truly points to this moment, perhaps it's not signaling an end in the way people once feared. Perhaps it's revealing a moment of pause, a sacred threshold, where the Church is invited to rediscover its mission not through thunder or turmoil, but through peace and perseverance. Pope Leo XIV's election may symbolize a new light rising gently over old stones, illuminating not the conclusion of the story, but the beginning of a deeper chapter. And in that stillness, as the world watches, many are beginning to see that prophecy need not be ominous. Sometimes, it is a gentle reminder calling the Church not to fear the future, but to walk forward with faith, one prayer at a time. Let us now step briefly back in time to the autumn of the year 2013. A few months after the start of a new pontificate that had drawn worldwide attention. On the 19th of October that year, a Catholic bishop by the name of Bernard Fellet, known for his traditional approach to doctrine, offered a personal reflection that stirred conversation among certain circles of the faithful. In his message, he raised concerns about what he viewed as signs of change in the Church, suggesting that such shifts might indicate the beginning of a more challenging spiritual period for the global Christian community. While some listeners took his remarks seriously, others interpreted them as symbolic or speculative. In the Church's long history, It is not unusual for voices from different traditions, whether more contemplative, pastoral, or doctrinal, to express differing views. These conversations are part of the organic life of a church that spans continents and cultures. But what was significant about this particular moment was not necessarily what was said, but the fact that the church found itself once again in the middle of deep reflection about identity, about direction, and about how to remain rooted while facing the ever-changing world. It's also important to remember that the papacy itself carries different meanings to different people. While there are those who view certain doctrinal or pastoral decisions with hesitation, there are also countless millions who resonate deeply with a pope's message of simplicity, mercy, and dialogue. Over the years, various pontiffs have taken different approaches, emphasizing themes such as social justice, interreligious understanding, and care for creation. These messages, often grounded in scripture and tradition, have inspired people from all walks of life. Back in February of 2014, for instance, a World Values Survey revealed that large portions of the global population viewed the Catholic leadership positively, especially for its efforts to bring people together across divides. From the neighborhoods of South America to the bustling cities of Asia and Europe, there was a sense that the papacy was being watched not only by Catholics, but by people of many backgrounds and beliefs. For them, the message wasn't just about church documents or decisions, it was about the personal example of compassion, service, and outreach. Still, within the church itself, as with any centuries-old institution, there are moments when diverse perspectives emerge. These are not signs of disunity, but reminders of the church's living nature. Throughout history, councils have debated, scholars have written, and pastors have prayed for clarity in how best to serve the gospel. Letters and reflections, whether in support or concern, have been part of this sacred process. One notable example of such a letter came in August of 2018, when a retired archbishop shared his own deeply personal thoughts in an 11-page message that sparked global headlines. His words were directed not just at leadership, but at the broader need for renewal, transparency, and spiritual integrity. While the letter was met with differing reactions, it once again reminded the faithful that the Church is not immune to questions or calls for reform. It is a community of believers seeking, through grace, to walk faithfully in every generation. Fast forward to today, and the global conversation about the Church remains vibrant. On YouTube, in articles, and across parishes and pews, people continue to reflect on the future, asking what lies ahead for the Church in an increasingly complex world. But instead of focusing on division, many are choosing to focus on discernment, on how to remain anchored in truth while reaching out with love. And that brings us once more to the prophecy of Saint Malachy. For centuries, his mysterious list of 112 popes has intrigued theologians and historians alike. Many of the symbolic titles he used have been interpreted in creative and compelling ways. For example, the pope listed just before the final entry, often believed to refer to Pope Benedict XVI, was described by the Latin phrase Gloria Olivi, meaning the glory of the olive. Some have connected this phrase to peace, to contemplation, or even to monastic traditions, though interpretations vary. While not everyone agrees on the details or accuracy of St. Malachy's descriptions, what makes his writings so enduring is the sense of awe they inspire. Whether one sees them as historical curiosities or glimpses of divine foresight, they invite us into a larger mystery, a reminder that the Church, and those who shepherd it, move through time under the gaze of something greater. There's even a memorable moment from church history that shows just how seriously some took these prophetic lines. In 1958, just before the conclave that would eventually elect Pope John XXIII, Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York made a symbolic gesture that captured the imagination of many. Renting a boat filled with sheep, he sailed along the Tiber River in Rome, perhaps as a light-hearted but pointed nod to the prophecy, which referred to a shepherd and sailor. Whether this was a sincere act of faith or a moment of theatrical symbolism, it reminded everyone of how closely watched these prophetic themes had become. So what are we to make of it all? Is St. Malachy's final line a forecast of the end? Or is it a call to deeper renewal and reflection? With Pope Leo XIV now stepping into history as the latest successor of St. Peter, these questions feel more alive than ever. But rather than causing fear or confusion, they may actually lead us toward a greater trust, not in predictions, but in providence. And perhaps, in the quiet unfolding of this new pontificate, we are not witnessing a conclusion, but the careful opening of a chapter long prepared in silence. According to the long-debated prophecy attributed to Saint Malachy, the final name on his mysterious list, the one that follows 111 previous symbolic entries, is marked with a profound and weighty phrase: Petrus Romanus, or Peter the Roman. This title alone has stirred centuries of fascination and inquiry. Who would this final shepherd be? What would his mission look like? Would he be a literal man named Peter, or would the title point to something deeper, perhaps a symbolic return to the roots of the Church in Rome, to the simplicity and witness of Saint Peter himself? What adds to the intrigue is how several of Saint Malachy's earlier symbolic titles seem, at least in retrospect, to match astonishingly well with the popes they are believed to describe. Take, for example, Pope Urban VII. His prophetic motto, according to the list, was Ex onda Rossi, often interpreted as from the lily and the rose. While poetic, this description becomes even more interesting when we learn that Urban VII had familial ties to Florence, a city whose coat of arms prominently features a fleur de lis, a stylized lily, long associated with purity, nobility, and Marian symbolism. Then there is the beloved Pope John Paul II. His prophetic title was De Labor Solis, which translates to from the labor of the sun, or of the eclipse of the sun. Curiously, he was born on the 18th of May in the year 1920, a day marked by a partial solar eclipse. Even more strikingly, a solar eclipse also occurred during the time of his funeral in April of 2005. To those who believe in the accuracy of Saint Malachy's list, these moments are not coincidences, but confirmations, echoes of something greater at work, woven into the fabric of history. And yet, the deeper meaning behind the list may not be limited to poetic matches or historical trivia. Some theologians and thinkers suggest that the prophecy might point not just to individual pontiffs, but to the Church's journey as a whole through moments of light and shadow, triumph and trial, always returning to the cornerstone, Christ himself. It's also important to understand that the Church, over the span of 2 millennia, has seen moments of profound renewal and seasons of great testing. In every age, new questions arise. At times, these have come in the form of theological disputes, at others, through cultural challenges or shifting political climates. Yet through it all, the Church continues to stand not by its own strength, but by the enduring promise given in Matthew 16. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Rather than dwelling on darker historical moments, many scholars today focus instead on the resilience of the Church, its ability to rise, reform, and refocus time and again. It is not the scandals that define its essence, but the saints. Men and women of every generation who have lived the gospel with courage, devotion, and joy. Their legacy far outweighs any temporary missteps in the Church's long journey. Pope Leo XIV now carries this legacy forward not as a solitary figure, but as part of an unbroken line that stretches back to the Apostle Peter. His task is not to fulfill a prophecy, but to shepherd souls with humility, wisdom, and grace in a time that feels increasingly uncertain. In his brief time already as Pope, he has shown signs of being both a listener and a leader, quietly attentive to the needs of the Church, yet firmly grounded in the richness of Catholic tradition. Still, some continue to wonder, could the phrase, Peter the Roman, refer not to a specific name or birthplace, but to a symbolic return to the essence of the papacy itself? A recentering of the Church on its original mission to feed the sheep, to tend the lambs, to proclaim the gospel not from places of power, but from places of prayer. If so, then perhaps the prophecy is not about the end of time, but about a spiritual awakening, a call to simplicity, unity, and holiness. As discussions continue, and interpretations abound, one thing remains certain. Saint Malachy's vision, whether literal or symbolic, continues to stir hearts and minds. It reminds us that the Church is more than just an institution. It is a living body, a community of faith bound together, not by fear of the future, but by hope in Christ. And in that light, the mysterious phrase, Peter the Roman, takes on new meaning. Not as a harbinger of doom, but as a beacon, a reminder to return, to trust, and to walk faithfully in the steps of the first shepherd who once stood on the shores of Galilee and answered a single question with unwavering love. "Lord, you know that I love you." And to that, Christ replied, "Feed my sheep." As we turn the page on the most recent conclave and step into the earliest days of Pope Leo XIV's papacy, the name Peter the Roman lingers like an unfinished verse, part mystery, part mirror. For some, the idea that St. Malachy's final line could refer to this very moment feels like more than coincidence. It feels like convergence. But if this title is more symbolic than literal, as many scholars now believe, then what is it really pointing toward? To understand this, we must leave behind the surface of dates and mottos and instead ask deeper questions. What does it mean for the Church to return to its roots? What would it look like for the successor of Peter to embody the original mission of the Church, not as a ruler dressed in splendor, but as a servant walking beside the lowly, listening, guiding, and healing? St. Malachy's phrase, Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, does not name a man so much as it names a mission. The name Peter evokes the rock upon which Christ built his church. The term Roman evokes the heart of Catholic identity, grounded in apostolic tradition, rooted in the eternal city that has witnessed both triumphs and trials. Together, the phrase suggests a return to foundations not as nostalgia, but as renewal. And Pope Leo XIV arrives at a moment when such a renewal feels not only desirable, but necessary. Though the Church continues to grow in many corners of the world, especially in parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, it also faces a spiritual fatigue in places where the faith once flourished. The challenges of modern life, distraction, individualism, secularism can leave even the most devoted souls feeling adrift. In this atmosphere, the call of a shepherd must be more than institutional. It must be intimate. The Church, at its core, is not a system, but a sanctuary. It is not about control, it is about conversion. And perhaps that is what the prophecy alludes to. The final pope is not a herald of doom, but a signpost of return. A call to recenter, a call to remember. Under Pope Leo XIV, many are beginning to feel this shift not in grand proclamations, but in the way he chooses to walk. From his early public gestures, such as declining opulence in favor of simplicity, or asking for the blessing of the crowd before offering his own, it is clear that his leadership is not built on image, but on intention. Some theologians have described this moment as a Benedictine silence before a Franciscan wind. Others see it as the beginning of a Marian age, a time marked by purity, humility, and trust in the quiet movements of grace. Regardless of the framing, what is shared across many interpretations is the sense that we are entering a time of inward turning. A time of pruning, perhaps, but also of new fruit. The Church, like any living body, must undergo rhythms. Times of expansion and expression, followed by seasons of reflection and refinement. In the past, these moments have been led by Saint Benedict, Saint Francis, Saint Teresa of Avila, who called the Church not to be louder, but to be clearer. Not to fight culture wars, but to live the gospel with such luminous integrity that even those who did not believe could not help but notice the light. Could Pope Leo XIV be such a figure? It is too early to say with certainty. But already, his actions speak in ways that resonate with the deeper echoes of the Church's soul. He speaks softly, yet with precision. He does not seek controversy, but rather invites communion. He emphasizes the timeless truths of the faith while acknowledging the questions of the modern heart. And this is where Peter the Roman becomes more than a line in an old manuscript. It becomes an icon of identity. It invites the Church to become, once again, what it was at the beginning, a people not defined by structures or status, but by love. A people who feed the hungry, tend the wounded, welcome the stranger, and kneel beside the suffering. The early Church was not powerful in worldly terms. It had no cathedrals, no prestige, no global influence. And yet, it changed the world not by force, but by faithfulness. It stood in the face of empires, not with swords, but with sacraments. It did not conquer through laws, but through lives transformed by the presence of Christ. That spirit is what Peter the Roman might be pointing toward, not a single man, but a movement. Not the collapse of a church, but the collapse of everything that is not essential. In this light, the final pope is not a figure of fear, but of fidelity. He is not the last because the church is ending. He is the last because something old is being reborn. Under Leo XIV, we may witness a church that becomes smaller in some ways, but stronger in spirit. A church that lets go of applause and popularity to rediscover what it means to be poor in spirit, hungry for righteousness, meek, merciful, and pure of heart. A church that speaks less, but shines more. This is not the age of endings. It is the age of essentials. And in that light, the name Peter the Roman becomes a challenge to every believer. It asks each of us, are we willing to return? Are we willing to follow not the crowd, but the cross? Are we willing to rebuild not institutions, but altars in our hearts? Because the true church is not built on bricks. It is built on bodies offered in love, on souls surrendered in prayer, on lives lived in hidden holiness. And perhaps that is what this final entry in the prophecy means most of all. That when the list ends, the mission begins not in the hands of one man, but in the hearts of many. Pope Leo XIV may very well be the shepherd St. Malachy foresaw, not because of politics or power, but because of presence. Because he reminds the church of who she is. And in an age of noise, such a reminder is not just prophetic. It is priceless. In the weeks following the election of Pope Leo XIV, something curious began to happen not within the marble halls of the Vatican, but across the silent corners of the world. It did not begin with headlines or grand declarations. There were no grand unveilings, no sweeping reforms announced from balconies. And yet, beneath the surface, a movement was quietly forming. In parishes, seminaries, and homes, the church seemed to lean in, as if listening for something new, or perhaps something ancient that was finally being spoken again. It started, for some, with a simple gesture. The day after his election, Pope Leo XIV chose to walk, not to drive, to a nearby chapel to pray. No cameras followed. No speeches were given. But the image of a man in white robes walking through the cobbled streets of Rome in silence said more than 1,000 homilies. It whispered of humility. It spoke of a shepherd returning to prayer before proceeding to lead. And for many, it felt like the first breath of something sacred returning. Observers around the world began to take notice. Not in the way of political analysts or commentators dissecting policies, but in the quiet awe of people who sensed that something important was unfolding. In Manila, a group of university students began meeting weekly to read the early writings of the Church Fathers, inspired by the Pope's call to rediscover the wisdom of the past. In Buenos Aires, a neighborhood priest spoke tearfully at Mass, saying that Leo XIV reminded him of the pastors he had grown up with, gentle, firm, unshakably faithful. And in rural towns throughout Europe and North America, parishioners who had grown distant from church life found themselves watching again, not because of spectacle, but because of sincerity. It wasn't so much what Pope Leo was saying, it was how he was saying it. Or rather, how he was living it. His papacy, though still new, had already begun to take on the shape of a mirror, reflecting the deeper hunger of the faithful, not for novelty, but for nearness. In an age dominated by noise and algorithms, here was a man who spoke in pauses, who answered with parables rather than policies, who seemed to carry with him the quiet authority of someone who knew what it meant to be unseen by the world, but deeply known by God. This, for many, is what gave new weight to the prophecy of St. Malachy. For if Peter the Roman was never meant to be a literal name, but rather a portrait of a certain kind of leadership, a return to the roots of the Church, a rekindling of apostolic spirit, then perhaps it is not the person of Leo XIV that fulfills the prophecy, but the path he is inviting the Church to walk. His decision to live not in the papal apartments, but in a modest residence among other clergy, was not simply a choice of housing. It was a choice of heart. A decision to be among, not above. A statement, without words, that the Church's strength lies not in its towers, but in its tables where the hungry are fed, the grieving comforted, and the lonely heard. Even in his first encyclical, titled Lux in Silentio, Light in Silence, Pope Leo XIV invited the faithful to consider the power of stillness. He wrote not with urgency, but with clarity. He did not begin with warnings or criticisms, but with a reflection on the necessity of contemplation in a world addicted to speed. He encouraged Catholics everywhere to create pockets of prayer in their daily lives, to turn ordinary moments into sacred space. To light candles not just on altars, but in the heart. The response was immediate, not explosive, but enduring. Monasteries reported an increase in vocations. Eucharistic adoration chapels began filling, even in urban centers. Young adults started forming reading groups to study scripture not academically, but devotionally. In ways that no program or media campaign could have orchestrated, the church was beginning to breathe again. And yet, amid this gentle renewal, the questions persist. What does the prophecy of St. Malachy mean now in this new chapter? Is Leo XIV truly the final pope, as some still suggest? Or have we misunderstood the purpose of the prophecy altogether? Perhaps it was never about counting popes or predicting cataclysm. Perhaps it was always a parable meant not to prepare the church for destruction, but to remind it of its destiny. A destiny not tied to earthly structures, but to spiritual fidelity. Not about endings, but about enduring. If that is true, then Leo XIV does not stand as a conclusion, but as a compass. A symbol not of what is finishing, but of what is being refined. And as more people come to see this, the conversation around the prophecy is shifting. It is no longer about fear. It is about focus. No longer about guessing dates or decoding lines, but about becoming what the church was always meant to be: a witness. Not a fortress, but a family. Not a system, but a sanctuary. Not a relic of the past, but a light for the world. In his homily on the second Sunday of Easter, Pope Leo XIV said something that stayed with many who heard it. The world does not need us to predict the future. It needs us to be faithful in the present. If we do that, the future will take care of itself. And maybe that is the real message behind the mysterious phrase, Peter the Roman. It is not a map for what is to come, but a mirror reflecting who we are called to become. And if the church can remember that, if it can remain faithful, humble and rooted, then perhaps the prophecy is not about what ends, but about what lasts. Across continents and cultures, in chapels filled with incense, and in homes warmed by whispered prayer, the faithful continue to wonder, what does it mean to speak of the last pope? Is it a conclusion, a warning, or something else entirely, perhaps a calling to examine the heart of the church in a new light? In the days following the elevation of Pope Leo XIV, this question has found its way into countless conversations. From seminarians in Nairobi to lay Catholics in Krakow, from theologians in Rome to young pilgrims lighting candles in Guadeloupe, the ancient phrase, Peter the Roman, has begun to resonate anew, not as a foreboding announcement, but as a riddle worth contemplating. In the West, where the Church has long contended with shifting cultural tides, many interpret the prophecy not as a message of doom, but as a sign of invitation. They see in Pope Leo XIV's humility not the end of an age, but the beginning of purification, a pruning that does not kill the tree, but strengthens its roots. For these Catholics, the final pope is not a bearer of catastrophe, but a bridge toward renewal, where the ancient truths of the gospel are reawakened in lives that have grown weary of noise and novelty. Meanwhile, in parts of Africa and Asia, where Catholicism continues to flourish with youthful vitality, the prophecy holds a different meaning altogether. It is not spoken of with fear or finality, but with fascination. Many view it symbolically as a reference not to the literal end of the papacy, but to a pope who reflects the universality of the Church, a shepherd who embodies the global face of Catholicism. Pope Leo XIV, with his multicultural pastoral background, his fluent Spanish and English, and his deep connection to Latin American spirituality, feels to many like a fitting fulfillment of that idea. A Roman in spirit, yet a son of the world. In these regions, where faith is less entangled with cultural politics and more rooted in community and celebration, the message of Peter the Roman is often received with joy. It is seen as a reminder that the Church's mission continues, perhaps with greater urgency, but also with greater clarity. For young Catholics in these areas, the final pope is not the end of their faith journey. If anything, it is the beginning of their call to serve with courage, to proclaim Christ with conviction, and to walk with the Church into whatever future God designs. Even in the Vatican, where tradition and theology intertwine with diplomacy and liturgy. There is a measured openness to discussing the prophecy not as doctrine, of course, but as a cultural phenomenon that continues to capture imagination. Some scholars suggest that the phrase, last pope, is not about papal succession at all, but about the return to apostolic spirit. In this view, Peter the Roman is a symbol, not a man. He represents a pope who leads not from a throne, but from the cross. Not by decrees, but by example. And Pope Leo XIV, many believe, fits this image with quiet precision. Already, his approach to leadership reflects a shift from the administrative to the contemplative. He has reduced formal appearances, increased his time in personal prayer, and repeatedly called the Church to remember the forgotten, the poor, the elderly, the imprisoned, and the unborn. His speeches are brief, but his silences speak volumes. His first public blessing was not preceded by a political address, but by a request. "Pray for me," he said, "and I will pray for you." To some, these may seem like small gestures. But to those who listen closely, they echo something ancient. They feel like a return not to nostalgia, but to origin. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of the final prophecy. That the Church, after centuries of complexity, must once again remember who she is. She is the bride of Christ. She is the voice of mercy. She is the presence of hope in a world that often forgets how to hope. In Brazil, a group of young Catholics has begun gathering every Friday evening to reflect on papal writings through the ages. But they do not begin with the recent ones. They begin with the letters of St. Peter, then move forward slowly, connecting each teaching not as separate events, but as one living conversation across time. They call it the Journey of the Rock, an homage to the unbroken line from Galilee to Rome, from fisherman to pontiff. In France, a monastic community that had dwindled to just 6 elderly monks has begun to attract new vocations again. Not because of advertising, but because of atmosphere. One young man who entered recently explained that he saw a photo of Pope Leo XIV sitting alone in a chapel, face bowed, hands folded. "That image," he said, "reminded me that prayer still matters, that silence still speaks." And in Canada, a Catholic high school, once struggling to hold students' attention, has launched a new series of retreats. The title of the first retreat, Peter the Roman, Becoming the Shepherd in Our Time. Students are taught not about the apocalypse, but about service. They are encouraged to write letters to the lonely, to visit nursing homes, to fast not for ritual, but for renewal. These are not grand, global changes. They are small movements. But then again, so was Bethlehem. So was Nazareth. So was the empty tomb. And perhaps this is what the prophecy was always about, not a timeline, but a turning. Not a countdown, but a call. Not the final pope in a literal sense, but the final reminder of what the papacy is meant to be. A living witness to the love of Christ in every age. So as Pope Leo XIV continues his quiet work, the eyes of the world remain fixed not on his robes or his titles, but on his footsteps. Where will he go? Whom will he serve? How will he speak to a generation both skeptical and searching? The answer, perhaps, is already unfolding. Not in dramatic events, but in everyday holiness. In the way a shepherd tends to his flock, not with thunder, but with trust. Not with fear, but with faith. And in that gentle unfolding, the final line of St. Malachy's prophecy begins to sound less like a warning and more like a whisper. A whisper that says, return, rebuild, remember. Far from the echoing halls of the Vatican, away from the marble floors and sweeping vestments, the early days of Pope Leo XIV's papacy are stirring something far more enduring than headlines: quiet conversion. Not just among bishops or scholars, but among everyday Catholics, the mothers, teachers, students, farmers, nurses, retirees, those who rise early, work hard, and try each day to keep faith alive in ordinary moments. And perhaps this is the true measure of any pontificate, not how it echoes through cathedrals, but how it enters kitchens and classrooms, how it lingers in morning prayers and evening walks. In cities and villages alike, something gentle is beginning to spread. It doesn't come in waves of dramatic change, but in the soft ripples of renewed devotion. A woman in Poland, who had quietly stopped attending Mass after her husband's passing, shared with her parish priest that something about the new pope's humble tone made her feel invited again. She couldn't explain it exactly. She hadn't followed church news in years. But when she saw him bow his head and ask for prayers before offering his own, she wept. "It felt like he was bowing with us," she said, "not over us." In the Philippines, a group of fishermen have begun praying the rosary together at dawn before casting their nets. It's not part of any parish program. There are no flyers, no hashtags, no videos. They simply started because one of them heard Pope Leo had spoken of the importance of silence, and how every day should begin with a conversation with God. He said silence is not emptiness, the man told his friends. It's an invitation, so we answer it. Meanwhile, in a small town in Italy, a teenager named Marco, who once mocked religion as outdated, is now writing icons with his grandmother. He doesn't fully understand the theology yet. But he says there's something about the way Leo XIV speaks calm, unwavering, patient that makes him want to understand. It doesn't sound like rules anymore, he says. It sounds like a story I want to be part of. These are not isolated reactions. All across the world, stories are emerging not of grand gestures, but of small awakenings. A young woman in Nigeria who struggled with anxiety found comfort in the Pope's words about stillness. She wrote in her journal, "For the first time, I believe holiness might be possible for someone like me, not perfect, not loud, just present." In Montreal, a retired priest who had quietly stepped back from ministry due to health reasons began recording audio reflections again, inspired by the Pope's encouragement that every voice, no matter how small, matters in the body of Christ. What ties all these responses together is not doctrine alone, but something more intimate: recognition. Recognition that in Pope Leo XIV, the Church has been given a leader who does not seek to impress, but to invite, who does not seek to lecture, but to listen, who reminds the faithful not just of what the Church teaches, but of what the Church is: a home, not a courtroom, a lampstand, not a pedestal. Even online, where faith can often feel distorted or debated into fragments, a new kind of content is beginning to emerge. Short reels of the Pope's simple gestures, blessing a disabled child, lingering in prayer beside the tomb of a forgotten martyr, speaking gently to a group of workers. These images are being shared not with commentary, but with silence, as if those watching know that words would only get in the way. One content creator, a young father from Argentina, shared a video titled, "He reminds me of my grandpa." It was a side-by-side of Pope Leo tying his shoe during a public appearance, next to a clip of his own grandfather doing the same thing. "This isn't about power," the caption read. "It's about presence. That's what we need." And that may be the secret to the Pope's growing influence. He does not demand attention. He earns trust. In a world filled with voices that shout, his voice calms. In an era built around speed, his pace slows people down. He is not a man trying to define the future. He is a man rooted in something that doesn't move, and because of that, people are beginning to move with him. Even those who had long grown distant from the Church are starting to reimagine what it means to believe again. In Australia, a man who left the Church after his mother's death said he walked into a church again for the first time in 15 years, not because of a sermon, but because of something the Pope had said in passing. The Church is not only where we celebrate joy, but also where we are allowed to cry. That single sentence brought him back. "I didn't think anyone in the Church saw my grief," he said. But he did. It is moments like these that remind us, holiness does not always look like grandeur. Sometimes it looks like gentleness. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Sometimes it feels like being seen. Pope Leo XIV, without intending it, is becoming a mirror through which millions are rediscovering what faith feels like, not as pressure, but as peace. Not as fear, but as freedom. He has not reinvented the Church. He has reintroduced her quietly, patiently, as a place not of rules first, but of rest. And people are responding not because he told them to, but because, through his life, he is showing them how. In this light, the prophecy of Peter the Roman begins to shimmer with new meaning. Perhaps the final pope is not the last in a line, but the first in a return. Perhaps it is not about the collapse of anything but the rising of everything that had been buried. The simple faith of the fishermen, the courage of the early martyrs, the embrace of a church that calls each of us by name. And if that is true, then the real prophecy is not written in Latin. It is written in lives quiet, faithful, unseen. Lives that begin again each morning with a prayer. Lives that now, inspired by Leo XIV, dare to believe that even in the smallest of gestures, eternity can begin again. And as the first months of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate unfold, a new kind of rhythm begins to settle into the life of the Church. Not one dictated by institutions or calendars alone, but by something deeper, an interior stillness, a spiritual recalibration. The kind that doesn't shout through headlines, but hums softly beneath the surface of things. The kind that invites not crowds, but conscience. And in that stillness, the question continues to rise. Have we misunderstood what it meant for the prophecy to reach its final line? St. Malachy's list was never meant to be a script for speculation. And yet, it has captured the imagination for centuries. Line after line, it seemed to whisper through history quiet echoes describing the popes who have come and gone, some in glory, others in trial. But now, with the name Peter the Roman standing alone at the end, the faithful are asking not only what it means, but what it demands. Because if this final phrase was never about doom, but about direction, if it was never about fear, but about faithfulness, then perhaps its truest fulfillment is not found in one man's name, but in the way the Church reclaims her identity through him. And this is where Pope Leo XIV, whether or not he is the one Malachy foresaw, begins to resonate so profoundly with the spirit of the prophecy. He is not loud. He is not flashy. His garments are simple, his language spare. But in this simplicity, many see the echo of St. Peter himself, an imperfect man transformed not by might, but by mercy. A man who knew what it meant to stumble, but also what it meant to stand up again and follow. Already, Pope Leo has begun to shift the focus not with decrees, but with direction. He speaks of the Church not as a fortress, but as a field hospital. He calls for priests to be more present, for families to be more prayerful, for institutions to become more human. He does not reject tradition. He returns to it, not to preserve it in glass, but to make it breathe again. And the people are noticing. In parishes around the world, mass attendance long in quiet decline is beginning to flicker back to life. Not in overwhelming numbers yet, but in spirit. Parents who once sat in the back pew, checking their watches, now linger after liturgy. Children are asking questions about saints again, not as myths, but as mentors. Catechists are receiving messages from teenagers who want to volunteer, not because they were told to, but because something about the way the Pope speaks has made them curious about holiness. This is not a revival built on emotion. It is built on encounter, one by one, slowly, steadily. And yet, the broader world continues to watch, asking its own questions. Will Pope Leo XIV change church policy? Will he surprise us? Will he disrupt or restore? But perhaps those questions miss the point. Because what is quietly emerging is not a change in policy, but a change in posture. Not new declarations, but renewed devotion. A return to the gospel in its most unadorned form. A return to the tenderness of the first Eucharist, the trembling courage of the early martyrs, the fire of Pentecost that did not begin with documents, but with hearts set aflame. That is what makes this moment feel so layered, so full, so strangely familiar. It's as if the Church, through Pope Leo's quiet steps, is remembering herself. Not her reputation, but her reason. Not her structure, but her soul. And the prophecy. It begins to feel less like a warning and more like a mirror. A reflection held up not to scare the faithful, but to steady them. Not to count down to the end, but to call them back to the beginning. Back to the fishermen. Back to the hillside. Back to the table where bread was broken and eyes were opened. And if Pope Leo XIV is indeed a reflection of Peter the Roman, then perhaps what St. Malachy foresaw was not an event, but a restoration. Not destruction, but direction. A leader who would carry the heart of the first shepherd, not as a figurehead, but as a living invitation to all of us to walk again the path of the apostles, barefoot if needed, but never alone. The world still spins, uncertain as ever. Questions still remain. And yet, in 1,000 small places from village churches to crowded cities, something ancient is stirring. A whisper among the faithful. A breath of hope in the silence. Not because someone said the end is near, but because someone quietly reminded them that the church's purpose has never changed. To love, to serve, to witness. And in that rediscovery, the final line of the prophecy becomes not a conclusion, but a beginning waiting to unfold. And so, as the dust of speculation settles, and the rhythm of ordinary life in the church resumes, we are left not with a dramatic conclusion, but with something far more enduring. A choice. The prophecy of St. Malachy, with all its mystery and magnetism, does not demand that we predict the future. It asks that we reflect on the present, on where we are, on who we have become, on what we, as the Church, are called to be. Pope Leo XIV, whether or not he fulfills the final line of an ancient list, has become something more meaningful than a name attached to prophecy. He has become a mirror for the Church's soul, a reminder that holiness is not measured by history's approval, but by heaven's gaze. His papacy, still in its early days, is not shaped by revolutions or reforms, but by reorientation. A turning back. A gentle reawakening of what it means to walk with Christ, not above the world, but beside it. Perhaps that is what St. Malachy saw, not a final pope in the dramatic sense, but a final reminder. A final invitation for the Church to return to the source. To reclaim what had been forgotten, not doctrine, but devotion. Not pomp, but presence. Not noise, but the nearness of God. In the soft footsteps of Leo XIV, the Church finds a new rhythm. One that doesn't rush. One that doesn't panic. One that listens. And in that rhythm, people across the world are beginning to rise quietly, faithfully, one by one. Parents leading prayer in their homes. Teenagers finding meaning in silence. Priests rediscovering joy in the sacraments. Artists painting again. Elderly souls remembering that their prayers still move mountains. Children watching a humble man in white and wondering what it might mean to be good, truly good, in a complicated world. This is the miracle already unfolding. Not a spectacle. A stirring. The prophecy, it seems, has done its work not by pointing to an end, but by preparing the Church to begin again. Not with certainty, but with surrender. Not with fear, but with faith. And in the heart of Rome, beneath the shadow of an ancient dome, a new shepherd prays. Quietly, simply, without fanfare. As the world watches, and somewhere deep in the soul of the Church, an old truth whispers again. The rock still stands.